Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the CrySP speaker series on privacy. This is our first talk of the 12-13 year. Thank you for coming, and our speaker today is Professor Micah Sherr from Georgetown University. Professor Sherr is known for a lot of things, including work on electronic voting systems and anonymous communications networks, but today he'll be talking to us about something else he works on, which is about security and privacy of wiretapping. So let's welcome our speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you, Ian, for inviting me to speak today. I want to start by just acknowledging some of my unindicted co-conspirators, also known as co-authors in some of these papers. Anything that I get wrong is their fault. Let me start by just giving the obligatory note about Georgetown, if you're not familiar with it. It's a university founded in 1789, located in the heart of Washington, D.C., in the Georgetown area. Traditionally, Georgetown has had strengths in government, foreign studies, and law. Very recently, we're going what we term the decade of science. And what we're trying to do is, or what the university is trying to do from a high level, from the president of the university on down, is to really increase the research output of the sciences within Georgetown, including computer science. So we've done things like doubled the faculty size of the computer science department, which sounds really good up until you find out what that size actually is. We started our master's and PhD programs recently, and really we're targeting a few selected areas, including security and algorithms and information retrieval. So that's my little spiel. But today what I'm going to talk about is the security of legally authorized domestic wiretap systems. So these are wiretap systems where you would have some law enforcement agency, such as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police or the FBI, send some court order to your wireless carrier to legally eavesdrop on you. So why is this a computer science problem? Well, there's lots of prior work on illegal wiretapping and countermeasures, right? We know that Alice and Bob, there might be an Eve on the line, and we know how to build crypto protocols that ensure that Eve cannot understand the actual plain text of their communication. That isn't so much true for these legally authorized wiretap systems. These systems have had very little public scrutiny, and the reason is that they're very closed source black boxes. It's very difficult to actually obtain one of these wiretap systems and poke around on it. And the reason that is because these telephone wiretap systems are only sold to law enforcement agencies. You can't just go out and buy them. This is somewhat problematic because it's had so few eyes looked at it. And at the same time, these wiretap records are viewed with very little skepticism by judges and juries. When they're presented in trial as evidence, juries and judges often view the wiretap transcripts as sacrosanct. And this has some interesting implications to the public because these wiretap systems are used both for investigative intelligence and for evidence gathering for legal proceedings. And if the wiretap evidence has been altered or is incomplete, that could be bad both from a law enforcement point of view and also from a judicial point of view. So that's why we started out looking at wiretap systems. I should also mention briefly what this talk isn't about. So I'm sure that you've heard stories about what the NSA may or may not be doing during the Bush era domestic wiretap programs and AT&T. I'm not actually going to talk much about this. One of the reasons is I don't know much about this, which is a good reason for me not to talk about it. But also, I don't consider this a legally authorized wiretapping system. This is something that's done in bulk. They basically take a large undersea cable and listen in and just copy all of the data. Legally authorized wiretap systems used by law enforcement agencies, domestic law enforcement agencies, have a whole other set of operations and requirements, legal requirements about what they can and cannot do. This is much less closely regulated. So the questions that I and my co-authors were interested in is whether legal wiretapping done by the FBI and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police are reliable, trustworthy, and secure. Can they be tampered with? Do these systems collect everything that they're supposed to? And how vulnerable are they to manipulation? And these are questions that hadn't really been answered before, at least in the public literature. So in my talk today, I'm going to talk about two different wiretap architectures. The older loop extender wiretap systems, which existed from the early 1900s in some form or another, up until around 2000. And they're gradually being phased out. And I'll also talk about the newer CLEA Wiretap systems that have replaced it. Unfortunately, some of this work is somewhat US-centric, particularly when I talk about the laws and regulations, but a lot of what's done in the US is also applies to what Canada is doing and what other Western democracies in Europe are doing. So if I have time, I will conclude by talking about, okay, so the first few parts about breaking wiretap systems. There's breaking the old wiretap systems and doing terrible things to them. There's breaking the new wiretap systems and doing terrible things to them. And then what we've worked on recently is, can we build more accountable and more robust wiretap systems without costing telephone companies trillions of dollars to re-engineer their systems? So let me begin by describing the two types of wiretap systems, because it's not exactly the way that wiretaps are portrayed in CSI and other common media outlets aren't necessarily the way they're actually applied in real life. So the vast majority of wiretaps conducted in the US and Canada and most other democracies are characterized as pen register trap and trace devices. And all these things do is they provide a real-time trace of call metadata. So who is calling whom, how long the call lasts for, the time of the call. And it's pretty easy for a law enforcement agency to get an order to do a pen register or a trap and trace. All they need to do is argue that it's germane or relevant to a particular investigation. They don't need to show probable cause. It's very easy. The key point here is that it does not include content. When most people think of wiretaps, what they think of is actually content wiretaps, where you're recording both the metadata, but also, so both the call identifying information, but also the content of the call. The call audio, and this includes things with cellular communication, things like text messages, and also data messages sent over 3G or 4G. It's much more expensive for a number of reasons for law enforcement agencies to conduct content wiretaps. One of the reasons is that they need to listen in real time on the tap, and whenever someone is speaking who's not the subject of the investigation, they have to press a mute button. So in the United States, for example, if the FBI is interested in my telephone conversations and my wife picks up our landline, they can't listen in on that communication unless she's talking to me. And it's my wife, so they can't listen in anyway. But that's different. For this, the governments have to establish probable cause. They have to argue not only is it relevant, but they have probable cause that the information gathered for this more intrusive content wiretap is going to be relevant and necessary for an investigation. So 90% of wiretaps are about the pen register kinds. The remaining 10% are content wiretaps. And there's an order of magnitude difference in terms of the prices of running these wiretaps. So a brief review, a very, very high-level review of how your telephone system, or how the telephone system works. So you have telephone subscribers who connect through something, some device, either a copper line telephone, a landline telephone, or a wireless phone, a mobile phone. And they are communicating with something called a central office. And it used to be the case in the days of landline communication that a town or some small geographic area would have a central office, and all of the telephone lines would form a direct loop with that central office. And from the central office, using a number of protocols, SS7, sometimes over IP, it goes through this kind of big amorphous telephone network, and somehow or other it gets routed to the CALEA central office. And from the CALEA central office, it'll connect and ring the caller. And what happens in kind of this line and this line could either be fairly complicated in the case of wireless and fairly straightforward in terms of wired communication. So how does your actual telephone work? So if you take apart your telephone, and don't take apart your iPhone yet, but by telephone I mean a landline telephone here. How your old telephone system works is it consists of two cables, which forms a closed loop with your central office. And over that connection, it runs both AC and DC currents. The DC currents are used to convey hook status. So whether your phone is on hook or off hook. They'll either have the DC current go through or they won't. During a call, the audio is going to be relayed through the AC signal. So what this means is whenever they need to do in-band signaling or whenever they need to do other signals other than hook status, what they'll do is they'll use in-band audio. So for example, if I wanted to route a call on my telephone, I would use audio signals, these numbers on the dial pad, which each produce a tone called a DTMF tone. And that tone would be carried through the audio, through the AC signal, and then interpreted by central office and converted from analog to digital. So there are a number of such in-band audio tones for dial tone, busy signal, audible rings. There's a large variety of them. So loop extender wiretaps were built for this landline telephone. At the time that these were constructed, there were no cell phones. This is what everybody had. So what we call the line between the target and the target's telco, we call that the target's line. This is that closed loop with two cables, one carrying AC and the other one carrying DC. The way that a loop extender works is you take this target line and you more or less kind of splice it to what's called the friendly line, which goes to the law enforcement agency. So someone would issue, if it was a content wiretap, actually in either case, all of this communication, it's a complete clone of the communication, both the content and any of the metadata are going to be relayed through the friendly line, which is nothing but another ordinary telephone line to the law enforcement agency. Sometimes this was done in the central office. Sometimes they climbed up a telephone pole. So how do they splice it? Well, they have this device called a loop extender, which is this kind of device. It's small with a bunch of wires coming out of it. I can tell you from personal experience, never try to carry this on an airplane. It really causes problems, particularly when you start explaining what it is. But two lines, it basically takes two lines into the target line and two lines into the friendly line and relays the communication. It's a fairly simple, straightforward device. On the other side of the friendly line is something called a dialed number recorder, or DNR. And this is a device that takes the telephone line, that spliced telephone line and the friendly line, and basically analyzes the analog signals and the analog signals and sends it to a computer and records the numbers that are dialed, who called in, the duration of the call, et cetera. I should point out that this is there's a mute minimize button. I don't know if you can read that here from in the back. This is for content wiretaps. Again, if the person who's being wiretapped isn't the target of the wiretap, then at least in the United States, they have to press the mute button. And there's some protocol about how long they have to wait before they can listen back in. Is there a question? They cannot hear. Okay, so the question was, the law enforcement agent who is in charge, the person who pissed someone off and has a terrible job of listening into some mundane conversation, can they actually hear anything when they press the mute button? No, they cannot. They don't hear anything at all, and there are protocols. This isn't a regulation, but there are kind of agreed upon protocols that say, well, the first time you do this, you have to wait 10 minutes, and then you wait 5 minutes, and then you wait 2.5 minutes. So you might miss something, and I'm sure that does happen. Okay, so what does the full wiretap apparatus look like? It looks like this. This is, we set this up in our lab, but this is what a law enforcement wiretap station would look like. You have the dialed number recorder coming in. This is one of these cables here is the friendly line. This is a grad student lab, so it's a little bit messy. You have a computer, and you can't possibly read this, but it essentially looks like an Excel spreadsheet of time of call, duration of call, and then the number that was actually called. And then for a content wiretap, you would have a tape recorder or some sort of recording device. This is a digital version of it. So I started off by saying that very few people have looked at wiretaps, and one of the reasons that I believe that few people have looked at wiretaps, at least openly looked at them, is that it's really hard to get these things. And the reason that it's really hard to get these things is that, at least in the United States, and I tried to look this up and I couldn't find it here, possession of the wiretap is actually illegal unless you're a law enforcement agency, and it's a felony to own one or to operate one. And it's not like a slap on the wrist felony. I can't imagine what that would be, but it's 5 years in a federal prison, and also states have their own kind of similar rules. And if you call the vendor and say, hey, I'm a researcher, I'm a professor, I'm a grad student, could you please send me your wiretap system because I want to go play with it and break it and embarrass you, oddly enough, they won't sell you one. So what you have to do is you have to go buy them on eBay. We got ours through, well, this is being recorded. We got one through eBay. We did not go to prison, although there was a fun few weeks where, you know, things happened. We had several interesting conversations with our general counsel. But the law, if you look it up, says that if you're operating under government contract and doing this, well, for the government, which it turns out we were because we have the National Science Foundation grant to do this, we get a get-out-of-jail-free card. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I have no idea what the regulations are here. I would just say be very, very, very careful if you want to take up this line of work, if you value your freedom. Okay, so we got a loop extender system, and we played around with it, and we broke it very quickly, and it's not because we were brilliant, it's because we actually bothered to ask the question, how easy could this system be manipulated from the viewpoint of the target of the wiretap? It turns out the system could be completely owned, and that's owned with a 0. So what are the attacks here? So we're able to manipulate the captured digits. This is, again, with the pen register wiretap. We can replace the real digits dialed with false digits. We can insert false call records that never actually existed into the log. And we can turn off, in the case of content wiretaps, the recording at will. And these are, I should mention that a key word here is unilateral. So when I give this talk, people say, well, why don't you just use encryption? Sure, you can use encryption. Alice and Bob can, you know, use AES or whatever, but Alice and Bob both have to be active participants in the crypto. And also, crypto doesn't hide the meta information, right? You'd need some sort of, you know, onion routing style telephone thing to hide the meta information. I should also mention that this is joint work with Matt, Sandy Clark, and Eric Cronin. Okay, so how can we manipulate the captured digits? Again, when you dial something on a landline telephone, you'll hear some tones when you dial these numbers. These tones are defined, they're actually 2 tones played at the same time, and the tones themselves are defined in some ISO standard. And this is what it is. So a 1 is 1209 hertz, played at the same time at 697 hertz. There are also all these extra things that don't appear in a standard telephone. I'll get to that later. Sure. I'm sorry? So us researchers, as part of what we were doing.
Yeah, but I mean, so you have a caller.
I see, okay. Yes. Right, I see, okay. So actually, for many of them, either party could decide to start launching these wiretaps. So either party, for a content wiretap, for example, can stop the recorder at will, and I'll explain in a minute how it does that. Yes, yes. For certain attacks, when you know, to insert fake numbers into the call record, it needs to be the caller, the person who's actually the target of the wiretap, not the person who's being called.
But this is also just the prevention between the law enforcement
That's something, right, so I'll talk about kind of more accountable wiretap systems later, but in this system, yeah, all they need to do, they don't have to do anything with this. They have a computer, they can just enter a record into a flat text file and call it a day. Okay, so these DTMF tones, again, are in-band audio tones sent through the AC signal, and they're interpreted by the telco switch. Now this DNR box, which is a separate switch, which exists at a law enforcement agency, also decodes these things. So both of them have this kind of lookup table, and both of them say, okay, well, it looks like it's near this and this, so it's a 5. Now, the standard lists a bunch of tolerances, because we can't build perfect pieces of hardware. The standard says, okay, well, here's the tolerances for the frequency of the tones, the amplitude, the twist, the difference between the two tones, the noise, and the amount of distortion on the line. And the key point here is that the same DTMF tone is being decoded by 2 separate devices, and no 2 decoders are identical. So how can that be exploited? So here, for example, is the acceptable range of tone amplitudes. And you can make this picture for frequencies and twist and whatever else. That's how it is defined in the standard. And the range that's going to actually be accepted by the telco switch is not going to line up exactly like this, because we can't build 2 pieces of equipment that have the exact same, well, we can't have a 0 tolerance. There's going to be some epsilon in there. And it's not necessarily on this side. It could be on that side. It could be smaller. It could be larger. But it won't be the same. And the range accepted by the wiretap decoder, the DNR, is going to have some other range. So what this allows the person doing the dialing to do is to actually do an attack we call confusion, which means that they can they can press a digit or generate a digit using cheap equipment that you can get from Wiretap, generate 2 tones that are kind of on the side of the spectrum such that it's going to be accepted and decoded by the Wiretap decoder, but totally missed by the switch. So you're, in a sense, inserting a non-existent digit. Now you might ask, well, how do you know what these tolerances are? And the short answer is you don't. You can do a binary search of the telco switch to see what numbers go through and what don't, because if you dial a number and it doesn't connect the call, then obviously you're outside the tolerances. Otherwise, you're inside the tolerances. But you obviously don't know what the tolerances of the DNR actually are. But on the other side of this, on the flip side, if you send something that's accepted by the telco switch but missed by the wiretap decoder, that's kind of an evasion attack. That number is just never going to appear on the wiretap record. And depending on what these actual tolerances are, you can either on one side of it confuse, or on the other side of it evade. And if you look at all the combinations, you can either do one or the other. So unfortunately, you don't know what kind of attack you're doing. You don't know which numbers are going to be evaded and which numbers are going to be confused. But you can add a bunch of horrible-looking telephone numbers into the wiretap record. And you can, for the confusion attacks, you can cause the record to look like it's, that the person dialed a 200 number telephone number. Yes? Yes. So I can probe my telco switch. I can run a kind of an algorithm for the number 1, right? And I can say, okay, these are the exact tolerances accepted by my telco switch. And then I can do the same thing for the number 2, 3, 4, all the way. And then I can say, okay, you know what? This is exactly what my switch supports. So I'm going to send a bunch of crazy numbers over here and a bunch of crazy numbers over here and hope that some of them are going to be interpreted by the wiretap system. I mean something outside of the tolerances, a random number. I'm sorry? In terms of frequency. You can kind of achieve a kind of somewhat crazy notion of perfect secrecy by for every number you send all the possible numbers, just the one that you actually use, you send over here. Okay, so that's one attack. A much simpler attack is recording suppression. So as I mentioned before, DC signaling is used to convey the hook status from the subscriber to his, that shouldn't be wireless, this is Roger's wired, to his wired connection. The problem is that you can't just kind of, the loop extender here can't just copy over the DC signal, because if it does, it's going to disconnect this friendly line, which is also a telephone line. So what they did, not so wisely, is they decided that they were going to encode this DC signal using an in-band audio signal. And for that, they chose somewhat arbitrarily, or for historic reasons, I guess, this C tone, which is a tone that doesn't normally appear on your telephone, but is defined by the standard. So the loop extender, when it detects that the target isn't using his telephone, or her telephone, it's going to relay this C tone, and the DNR is going to say, I hear a C tone, the phone's not in use. So for those of you who are familiar with phone phreaking, this is not all that different. So the problem here is that the DNR can't distinguish between tones that are generated by the loop extender and fake tones that are just kind of whistled by the target of the wiretap. So if you are very musically inclined and can hum two particular frequencies at the same time, maybe Alice can hum one and Bob can hum the other, it doesn't really matter, you can cause the system to just disconnect at will. Now, if you actually press, if you have a phone that has A, B, C, and D on it and you press C, it's going to be really loud. This is, for those of you who have several people at home and you have a landline and you pick it up and you're talking on the phone. And in my case, my mother would very frequently pick up the phone and start dialing before anybody, before checking to see whether the phone is in use. This is, I forgot this was being recorded, sorry. And press the buttons. It was really loud and you couldn't have a conversation over it. But it turns out that you can send very low amplitude C tones at 1/1000th of the volume or amplitude and actually cause the system to stop. So let me give you an example of this just to kind of demonstrate it. So this is a recall NG-NR 2000 loop extender system. And this is a conversation that was recorded by law enforcement, us, pretending to be law enforcement, between two people, between Eric Cronin and Sandy Clark in our lab.
Hello?
Hello, is this Bob?
Yeah, hi Alice, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm not bad.
I think I'll hang up now.
Okay, bye.
Okay, that was a very boring conversation, but this is the actual conversation that took place. So this isn't recorded using the wiretap equipment. This is recorded using this microphone.
Hello, is this Bob?
Yeah, hi Alice, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm not bad.
I think I'll hang up now.
Okay, bye.
There's the C tone.
Okay, Alice?
Yeah, Bob, you there?
Yeah, I don't feel listening in anymore.
All right, you got the stuff?
Yeah, I got all the stolen mattress tags you want for your counterfeit mattresses.
Excellent. I've got a buyer who'll take every one you've got. Send them to me as soon as possible.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Oh, so we're bad actors. But okay, so we notified the law enforcement, in this case the FBI, about this before we published because we didn't want to, go to jail. They were actually incredibly helpful. They were very grateful. We had wonderful meetings with them. And then in the New York Times, when this came out, they said, yeah, it doesn't really apply because the older wiretap systems, these loop extender systems, are being phased out. Everybody's moving to this CLEA infrastructure, which was a very good motivation for the next work that looked at, okay, well, how do these newer CLEA systems work? Are they also vulnerable? So nowadays, actually, this is probably out of date. CLEA represents more than 90% of deployed wiretap systems in the United States. CLEA stands for US law, but certainly Canada and many other European countries use CLEA equipment. They're sold, the same equipment is sold in many jurisdictions. We couldn't actually get one of these things. We tried really hard, but eBay did not have them listed. So what we did do is we bought some really expensive ISO specifications as to how these things actually work, and we did kind of an architectural analysis and said, okay, can we break the spec? Which is actually a little bit more interesting, because if we break the spec, then we broke all of them, as opposed to one particular implementation. Or we broke all of them that obey the spec. So very briefly, CLEA, the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, was signed by President Clinton, and it required telcos to wiretap at the switch. The motivation for the law was that people weren't using landlines, they're using mobile phones and other digital systems, and so the loop extender system just wasn't compatible with that at all. So instead, you want to wiretap at the switch, so that way the wiretap records the same thing that the switch records. They're the same piece of equipment. The law didn't specify how this should actually be done, but it said, hey, the law enforcement agencies and the telcos needed to get together and figure this out, and they needed to develop a voluntary standard, and if you didn't obey the standard, then the government was going to sue you. And the standard they came out with was called the J standard, and you can go out and for about $2,000 buy this wonderful book. If you can't fall asleep at night, this is a good thing to read. It was originally targeted at voice services, but it's been patched over the years to support VoIP and other systems and data. If you look it up, the first thing in here, it talks about the wiretap requirements, and we were excited. We thought, well, they're going to talk about security. They said the wiretap needs to be accurate, it needs to be complete, and most importantly, above all else, it needs to be undetectable by the person being wiretapped or by the other person on the phone call. So the system had to be undetectable. I read through every single page of this. It was awful, but something that we noticed was that there was no talk whatsoever in here, or nothing written about whether the system needed to be resistant to manipulation, what the threat model was, or any type of security analysis, formal or informal. So the J standard architecture looks like this, where you have different subscribed services, and each service is going to talk somehow to a telco switch. This could be a wired connection, this could be a wireless connection, this could be a data service. Each of these would have some switch operated by the telco. I mean, this is how the telco works. What CLEA added was this delivery function where all of the telcos would feed their information into the delivery function, and this delivery function would collect it and then send it somehow, typically over an ISDN line, to the law enforcement agency. So if I zoom in on this side of the picture in a little bit more detail, we see that there are a number of channels between the delivery function and the law enforcement agency. So for each of the services, you have a content channel, and this is only in the case of content wiretaps. If you're not doing a content wiretap, then this just isn't sent. So you have one channel for data, one for mobile voice, one for landline, if the wiretap covers all three of those services. In all cases, you'd have a call metadata channel, which would contain metadata about the call. What was the number being called? Did call waiting come through? Was this a conference call? There's about 200 different types of messages here. And if you look at the J standard, it covers, well, how is this actually sent? What's the protocol for this? Okay, and it covers all this stuff. It doesn't describe how this is done. And that's important because the telcos didn't want it to describe this because they spent billions of dollars in infrastructure to build this part. Building something new over here would be expensive, but not nearly as expensive as re-engineering the entire telco system. So the J standard defines a protocol, which I'm going to call LEASP, the Lawfully Authorized Electronic Surveillance Protocol, which defines a few hundred messages. The channel is open, it was closed, the target dials an outgoing number, the called party answers the call, and it kind of reads as kind of like a storyline going back and forth. And all of this is sent over the call metadata channel. So the problem with these wiretaps was that all of the subscribed telco services would multiplex the metadata over the same channel, the same metadata channel. So if there was some denial of service, if one of those overflowed the capacity of the channel, then all of the data from all of the telco services would be lost. So that's pretty bad. What's a little bit worse is that multiple wiretaps in the same central office would all use the same metadata channel. So if I'm being wiretapped and I'm able to cause denial of service, everybody else in my central office is also not going to have their wiretap information be successfully relayed to the law enforcement agency. So this isn't so bad if you have enough capacity. The problem is that the highest recommended bandwidth configuration for this was a 64 kilobits, and that's a small b, ISDN B channel, which I should say is perfectly adequate for statistical call models. People don't go crazy and dial thousands of numbers a second. This is more than enough capacity for moderately sized central office. The problem is that the person who controls the signaling information that can generate these messages is the person being wiretapped. I get to decide how often I dial my telephone. And they can't slow it down because of this undetectability thing. They can't say, well, the people being wiretapped aren't going to be able to signal as fast. So the target controls when the metadata messages are generated. If you pick up your phone, which is 1 bit of information, that generates a 100-byte least message. And the target has ample signaling capacity to overwhelm this kind of puny 64 kilobit per second connection, particularly given modern services that we have available today. So what happens if you overflow the call metadata channel? A few things. First, you get incomplete records of call identifying information. You get gaps in audio recording for content wiretaps. And the reason is the commands to tell the tape recorder or the recorder to start coming, or to start recording, come over this call metadata channel. And this is worse than loop extender wiretap systems because the denial of service extends to everything else happening in that central office. So we did a quick experiment. We took a 3G cellular modem when we decided to see how many UDP flows we could open per second. This is, I think, 3 years ago. We could generate, I think on Sprint, about 100 per second, and then they kind of capped it over. This generates, if you kind of do the math, far more, this would require far more bandwidth than is allocated for the entire ISDN B line. So this would be more than enough to overwhelm the capacity of the wiretap system using a single device. And okay, so that's one example. You can generate this in other ways using other services. If you have a data plan, you can just create IP flows. You can use ISDN feature keys if you have an ISDN telephone, which no one does. VoIP is unbelievably easy to do this. So you can generate thousands of calls per second. You can SMS flooding. This could be expensive for you. But in any of these ways, you can overwhelm the capacity of this call metadata channel. And once you do that, you can use any other service. Right? I can use my Verizon phone to overflow, my Verizon cell phone to overflow the capacity, and then use my Verizon landline to talk in an unmonitored way. Another attack is with call forwarding. So call forwarding is a service where I can set my phone up so that when someone calls me, it'll redirect to some other number. Now, each conversation, I can redirect several calls. Each conversation needs to be recorded. The problem for our content wiretap. The problem with this is that on a single T1 line, there are only 22 available channels to do this. So this leads to a problem, or an attack, I guess, where the target of the wiretap and several of his collaborators decide that they're going to actually break the system. So what they do is his friends call the target, and the target sets up call forwarding so that all of the calls that are called to him are going to be redirected to some kind of endless conversation that never ends. In this case, the United Airlines customer service representatives. Okay, so at this point, there are so many calls, he has so many friends, and 20 of them, that he overflows the capacity of the delivery function so that no more call content channels can reach the law enforcement agency. And then the target can call his cohort or turn off call forwarding, and the cohort could call him, and none of that information would be recorded. Okay, so in principle, the CLEA system the CLEA architecture is a better design than loop extender systems because we don't use in-band signaling. So at the very least, the parties can't just blow a whistle and cause the wiretap system to stop. The reason being is you have a separate content channels from your metadata channel. The problem is that if you look at the white papers and the advertising literature available online for these delivery functions, these CALEA switches, almost all of them support C-tone backwards compatibility mode, which is on by default in many cases. Why do they support this crazy thing? Well, because these are the same switches that the telcos invested billions of dollars in, and they don't want to replace it, and it deals with wiretaps by generating a C-tone. So wouldn't it be nice if they could just kind of use the same features to talk to this new digital CLEA system? And they do, which means that, again, Alice and Bob can use two whistles and cause the wiretap system to stop. So what can law enforcement actually do? they can, instead of using kind of statistical call models, they can provision more bandwidth, forget this whole ISDN line, use something that, use something with guaranteed service. They can provision each wiretap separately, so if one of the wiretaps is denied service, that all of them don't go down. They can certainly disable in-band signaling, and they can also reconcile the pen register transcripts with billing records, which are miraculously always accurate. Now, why don't they just use billing records? The reason they don't always use billing records is because billing records aren't necessarily available in real time. They're often not. These are often generated monthly or weekly in kind of overnight batch jobs. What the law enforcement wants is a real-time display of the communication that's occurring, and that's why they need these wiretaps. So these are all great recommendations. The problem here is that some of them require expensive changes to the telco infrastructure, particularly this one, and this one, and this one. And this could cost billions of dollars. So what can we learn from this? Are legal wiretap systems reliable? Are they secure? Are they trustworthy? The answer is it kind of depends. But certainly wiretap transcripts aren't infallible. We've shown this using actual equipment and also looking at some of the protocol specifications. And really the high level bit here is that when you design these things, when you design a security system, and I would argue that, that a wiretap system is inherently kind of a security system, you really need to consider an adversarial model. Now, do I believe that people are regularly generating C-tones on their lines to conduct illegal business? I very much doubt it, but I should say that we helped the economy a little bit, because after we produced this paper, there was a company called C-tone Technologies that we found on the internet that sold devices that generated C-tones for you at low amplitude. Okay, so I've got 15 minutes, so I want to allow some time for questions, so let me just kind of very quickly talk about some more recent work on accountable wiretapping. So existing CLEA systems lack accountability. We don't know who actually is watching the watchers here. And if you're familiar with the Greek wiretap scandal, this is a prime example of this. In Greece, I don't have my notes here. Okay, at some point in Greece, I think a few years ago, someone broke into the CLEA-based wiretap systems that were in place for legally authorized wiretaps and wiretapped the prime minister and some military folks and some US diplomats in the country. So we don't want that. We don't want the wiretap systems to be exploitable. We want some sort of accountability or auditable systems. So what we looked at was, can we build these more accountable, auditable wiretap systems and not force the telco companies to reinvest billions in their architecture? Okay. So some of the security goals, very briefly, integrity. We didn't want an adversary to be able to modify or corrupt the records. We wanted completeness. We wanted to identify any gaps. And also date compliance. We wanted to make sure that a wiretap that was only authorized for a particular date range, the wiretap didn't exceed those dates. In the United States, we have this kind of strange reporting requirement where every year there's a wiretap report where different courts need to aggregate their wiretap statistics, and it's all published at the end of the year. So we wanted to support this reporting goal in a way that's privacy preserving. So the way that we did this is we augmented the design of the CLEA architecture. So the old design kind of looked like this delivery function sent to the law enforcement. What we propose is adding something called an encryptor, which is a trusted device attached to your delivery function, and it sends a copy of the wiretap records, an encrypted copy, to this third-party log, which could be some commercial service or something run by the EFF or some political party, doesn't really matter. But the log won't be able to decipher, it does not have the decryption keys, so it won't be able to decipher all of these wiretap records. And if you think about it for a second, this sounds like somewhat of an idiotic idea. I'm proposing taking all of the wiretap records and shipping it off to some third-party service. Why in the world should we do that? That's a terrible idea. It's actually done currently. There are services out there that specialize in this, and they're pretty popular for law enforcement agencies that kind of handle all of this. So this is already done, and what we're proposing is just adding some privacy protections to this existing architecture. So we support two types of auditing. One is a court audit, and the idea here is that before trial, the court would come back to the wiretap log, the third-party log, and say, please give me all of your records pertaining to wiretap X. And the log would say, okay, I don't really know what records that is, but give me a date range and I'll send you everything I have. And the court can figure out, okay, this is relevant to me, this is relevant to me. The court can decrypt the encrypted information. This is a pretty simple protocol, actually. The accounting audit is used for reports. So you have an accountant who doesn't have permission to see any particular wiretap record, but needs to come up with aggregate statistics as to how many wiretaps, new wiretaps were created, how many were closed up. So we use, again, the court audit is fairly simple. We have a fairly simple protocol where each message is encoded with a timestamp in plain text. And then encrypted with that is the wiretap event. Person picked up phone, particular number was dialed, concatenated with some counter, and then kind of a hash of that, and then something called, which we call the aggregation block, which I'll describe in a bit, that's used for the accounting audit. And so in a court audit, the auditor is going to request all records between two particular times. The log will say, okay, here are all these records. And the court that authorized wiretap X will only have the decryption key for wiretap X and can throw everything out. Integrity protection through kind of standard techniques. Again, the encryptor is this trusted device. If the log decides to omit records, that'll be apparent by skips on the event counter, and we kind of bookend the wiretap records by using periodic heartbeat messages. So we can say, okay, every X seconds a heartbeat message came through, and if you don't have the proper number of heartbeat messages, then you're only getting a subset of the record you should be. So this is standard, straightforward stuff. The accounting audits are a little bit more interesting. And here we use this aggregation block. And what the aggregation block is a concatenation of fields. So the plain text is divided into fields where you have a random nonce, the random nonce you used in the previous record, and then some bit fields, which are 1 if this is a new, what does P stand for? Right. It's 1 if it's a new pen trap wiretap. It's 1 if it's a new content wiretap. It's 1 if it's expiring. It's 1 if it's one expiring pen trap, or 1 if it's an expiring content wiretap. And all this is encrypted using an additive homomorphic scheme. In our implementation, we use CALEA. And during an accounting audit, what the auditor will say, please give me anything between two particular times A and Z. And the log is going to add up all of these records, add up the ciphertext of these records, and return the sum ciphertext as well as the records that bookend those 2 times. And again, the log doesn't have the decryption key. So what does this actually look like? Here are some wiretap records, some new pen register, new content wiretap, another new content wiretap, something expired. So the log is going to return the sum of all these records. And you can take my word for it, but that is the sum. And it's also going to return, you can't see this too well on this projector, the first row and the last row. So what the auditor can do is it can compare the difference in the nonce columns in the sum with the difference based on the first and last values. So what happens is if it takes this column minus this column, certain things cancel out, right? So you're left with the 5 and you're left with the 9. Did I do that right? Yes, I did. And the difference there is 4, and that should be the difference here. And if those things don't add up, then something has been omitted, something has gone terribly wrong, and it can essentially do a binary search in the records to figure out where those missing records are or where the corruption has occurred. So the untrusted log allows for more audit-friendly wiretap processes. The court audit can detect omissions in the wiretap, in particular wiretap records, whereas the accountant can get more aggregate statistics. It has some additional, it provides additional accountability while requiring only small changes to the telco architecture. I don't have a slide for this, but very briefly, we figured out, we did the math, and based on our terrible implementation of this Java-based implementation, we could handle all of the US wiretaps that are currently occurring on, I think, 3 commodity PCs. So this is certainly, the amount of hardware required to do this is fairly minimal. Each central office would be required to have another machine. So millions, not billions. There are problems here. This does not necessarily solve the Greek wiretap scandal. It assumes trusted encryptors and delivery functions. We're currently working on other techniques using Dan Wallach's auditable logging system and Usenix Security 2000X that provides some of the features that we want here. That's work in progress. But to summarize my talk, hopefully I've convinced you that wiretap evidence isn't necessarily infallible, and we should consider, when we look at these wiretaps, we should look at them with some degree of scrutiny. The older wiretap systems, the older loop extender wiretap systems are just inherently bad. We shouldn't be using them. They're inherently vulnerable because of the use of in-band signaling. The newer digital systems suffer from inadequate provisioning, and we can solve this problem, or many of the problems, by throwing money at the problem, but it'll be a lot of money. So some of the main issues are that the wiretap systems are architectured around this multi-trillion-dollar existing system that we can't change very easily. So we can't have a flag day where we just switch to some other better system, because it is, not too difficult to design a new wiretap system from scratch. The new CLEA proposals suggest mandating wiretap. This is kind of the ongoing conversation in the United States, where the FBI and other law enforcement agencies want CLEA type support for internet-based communication, things like Skype. That kind of changes the ballgame, because now we're talking about doing things in wiretapping peer-to-peer systems as opposed to very centralized systems where it's easy to wiretap. The wiretap can occur at the central office. It's centralized. You have to route your call through the central office. In Skype, there is no central office. So the high-level takeaway is that we depend very heavily on these legally authorized wiretap systems, and that they deserve more scrutiny. So with that, I thank you very much for your time, and I would welcome any questions. Or no questions. Yeah. I'm sorry, could you say that a little bit louder? Yeah, there's a paper. Okay, so the question was, can the communicating parties use privacy-enhancing technologies that we know of, like crowds, I think you mentioned, or Tor, some technique like that to achieve privacy. And the answer is yes, absolutely. There's no reason why you couldn't use Skype over Tor other than performance. There was a paper a while ago out of, I think, Germany on ISDN mixes that proposed kind of doing something similar to this. I don't know too many systems that actually are deployed like that, but then again, using Skype avoids some of these issues. So if I was a criminal, I would use Skype. I'm glad that was recorded. Yeah. Well, it depends on the system. So, I have a VoIP. My landline at home is through RCN, a local cable provider. But it's still, the connection still is routed to my central office. In this case, it's operated by RCN as opposed to Verizon, which offers more copper line stuff. The same is true. So I'm blanking on the name of that big VoIP provider. Vonage, thank you. So Vonage, I'm told has CALEA support. Calls are still routed through Vonage servers. Now, if I open up, I can write my own SIP client, and of course I can communicate with you, just peer-to-peer, and that if I avoid the central office and I don't use a subscribed service, then law enforcement is out of luck. At least in the United States, I should mention that a lot of the laws regulating wiretaps deal with subscription services. So if you were offering a subscription voice service and you were considered a utility, you might be subject to wiretap regulations, and that's where this debate about what is Skype, is it a peer-to-peer service, is it a provider, those are kind of ongoing debates. They could. So they could have a wiretap looking at my RCN data connection, my broadband connection. And it would have the same architecture. It sends the same CDC message, the same call metadata messages between the delivery function and the law enforcement agency. If it was a content tap, it would have the entire IP payload sent as well. If I'm communicating over Tor or something on my computer, then it's not going to help them very much for the investigation, but certainly they would have a log of my actual packets. Yes? The whole CO would, if the central office is organized so that they used a single ISDN line, which is what was recommended, then all of their services would go down if one person did this. Now, what would happen if that actually occurred? I don't know. Maybe someone would notice and say, what the heck is going on? They'd look into it and say, this person just called 20,000 times a second. We need to buy more equipment. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I have no inkling as to whether or not anybody's actually attempted to do this. That's right. So there's only, for a single ISDN line, there's 22 content channels. So if you're wiretapping, if you've got a local mafia in your hometown and everybody needs to be wiretapped, then you better allocate a lot more ISDN lines. In the US, and again, I apologize for being so US focused. In the US, it's the law enforcement agency that has to actually pay the telco for these services. So the telco would say, thank you very much. I'm going to charge you $50,000 for each of these things. And if you need 20 of them, then I'm going to charge you whatever 50,000 times 20 is, $1 million. Yes?
You know about that device from
Yes, I do. There was a local police department in Florida who had a surplus who had a lot of surplus equipment and wanted to get rid of it and put a lot of it on eBay. It's also illegal to sell it and ship it. So I'm gonna go with yes, but presumably yes. So I'm going to preface this by saying I am not a lawyer, and also I am not a Canadian lawyer. I'm going to go with yes, at least in the United States, because having read this law many, many times, what it says in effect is that to own or operate wiretap equipment is illegal. So it doesn't matter whether you buy the thing. It's illegal to buy it, to operate it, to sell it, to ship it, and a few other verbs I can't remember. If you manufacture it yourself, that probably constitutes operating a wiretap system. I should mention that I think I misspoke earlier in the mattress tag, illegal mattress tag counterfeiting. The way that we recorded the actual conversation, now that I remember back to it, wasn't with the microphone. It was going to Radio Shack, and buying, I don't know, $20 worth of equipment to take the telephone line, put 2 alligator clips on it and throw it, plug the other end of that into, essentially a tape recorder. So this is doing more or less what a loop extender system is without the minimization, without the audio decoding. So wiretapping a landline telephone line is actually fairly easy. Not that I would recommend doing it. Yes? I've never had the question asked in that direction. I've had the question, am I helping? I don't think so. I'm not necessarily against wiretaps. What I'm against is the misuse of wiretaps. I personally, I'm putting off my scientist hat and putting on my private citizen hat for a moment. If you go out and show probable cause and get a wiretap order and listen in on someone, if that's what the law enforcement agency is doing, I don't personally have a problem with that. But what the auditable stuff, the audible wiretapping work attempts to do is to make sure that the wiretap is actually properly logged so that someone can, after the fact, go through and say, hey, wait a minute, you had 7 court orders, yet you had 2,000 wiretaps. Explain yourself. And I think that's something that's very valuable for us to do. Yes. Well, we kind of soldered a few things together to make it. So it's a tape recorder plus some cables plus some sort of adapter thing. We were so right. I mean, I guess the question is, do you consider a tape recorder to be a piece of wiretapping equipment? I personally would say no. I think my cell phone has a feature to start recording calls. We did it. All of our experiments were within our lab and under this NSF contract. I hope that was on video. So I'm not worried about going to prison anytime soon. But I think there's some common sense element to it, right? I mean, in many states and territories, there's 2-party consent, which means that if you record your phone conversation, the other party needs to be aware that you're recording it. During kind of the whole Monica Lewinsky, what's her name, who recorded the conversations, got in a little bit of trouble for that. This varies state to state. Certainly, I think there are ethical questions there about whether you should be recording a conversation that the other party doesn't know is being recorded.
We're out of time, actually. Speaker again.